Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri, and my co-host, as always, is Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. During the season, we examine the path to crowning an ultimate survivor in each year's college football playoff championship, and we thought it would be fun to do our first too early, however you want to say it, ranking of who that CFP may be, especially heading into the first year of the 12-team playoff. As always, you can find us on X and TikTok at the CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. I should say that's at CFP Survivor Show, not at the CFP Survivor Show. We're not we're not even going to go close to the Ohio State trademark there. Please, if you can, take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You know, Shehan, why don't you introduce us to this? So we're actually, because this is exciting. I know both of us had some fun coming up with our own lists, but tell us about the exercise.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, this was difficult. So we're about to head into the month of March. That's obviously when you start to see programs enter spring camp, when you start to see rosters finalize just a little bit. And on Tuesday, of course, we had the opportunity to go and discuss some of the teams that we felt like had improved and decreased the most over the offseason. And so from our perspective, it was time. We're going to put our first stamp of the season, probably before anybody else in the country has tried to really make a true attempt at putting together their college football playoff. We're going to go and look at what we have and try to put our 12-team playoff together. The other piece to mention about this is we have it clarified. It is going to be a 5+7 model. So 5 conference champions, 7 at-large bids. It's official now. That's what the first college football playoff is going to be. And so ultimately, we have all the information that we need to make a way too early version of this. Now, it must be said, a lot's going to change in the spring, whether that's players stepping up, whether that's freshmen getting on campus and impressing, whether that's post-spring, potentially players leaving and ending up at new programs as well. The roster turnover is not over at this point. But why wait until week 1 to finally make our picks? Let's put some ink to paper right now in the month of February.
You know, and I just want to also clarify for those listening, because too early top 25s, those happen all the time. Usually even some of them come out the moment the title game has ended. Before, obviously, a lot of things changed in the coaching ranks immediately afterwards. But remember, we're talking the college football playoff rankings and the way they're going to be designed at the end of the regular season this upcoming year. So the top 4 spots have to go to the top 4 conference champions. So that really shook things up compared to, I would say, a lot of the top 25 rankings that you've seen out there. And I want to remind our listeners that we're going to be looking at the top 4 conference champs have to be the top 4 spots, and therefore they will get that first round bye. And then you get into the rest. Now, theoretically, just to be clear, as Shehan said, it's a 5+7, the 5 conference champs. You could have that weird year where there might be somehow a G5 champ that is ranked higher than one of the either the SEC, Big Ten, unlikely, or Big 12 and ACC champ. We're gonna assume, I don't think either of us are assuming that's going to happen, but typically that means a G5 is going to be somewhere in those at-large, mixed amongst the at-large bids. So all of that said, I think we're not going to be too surprised by a couple of these. Who did you rank? Well, how should we do this? Should we say our top 4, or did you want to just instead say who's your? We're going to know the top 4 conference champs, or would you rather just say who's your number 1 seed?
Let's start with our number 1 seed, and obviously that gets us into the conference champ conversation. So, with my number 1 overall seed, I was picking between 2 teams, who to me are the 2 title favorites heading into 2024. And I opted to go with familiarity. With my number 1 seed, I'm going with the SEC champion, Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia, of course, brings back Carson Beck. They do lose Brock Bowers, but Oscar Delp is a big-time player and a big-time playmaker. They brought in a couple of key transfers at key position, including London Humphreys at receiver, who should be a dynamic weapon for them. And you also look at what they have been over the last couple of years. I mean, they were one upset away last year from potentially winning 3 straight national championships, becoming the first team since the University of Minnesota in the 1930s to do it. So a lot of this is a bet on familiarity. It's a bet on dominance. It's a bet on opportunity, I would say, as well. When I look at the SEC right now, and we'll have an opportunity to talk about more SEC teams very soon, uh, they are by far, to me, the most complete team in terms of what they bring back, what they've done, their track record of development, and their strategy for approaching the upcoming season. So, number one right now, I'm going safe, but I think I'm going correct, the Georgia Bulldogs.
Yeah, I like that pick. I was having difficulty going between my top two. I mean, I actually put them as number two only because I thought they had a tougher schedule. And when I was trying to pick between two teams, and I did this several times throughout my top 12, or no, I should say my 12 selections, predictions for the playoff, I thought that with that opening game against Clemson in Atlanta, now I think Georgia's absolutely going to be favored in that game, but that's another potential for a hiccup. They play at Kentucky, which again, more than likely than not, Georgia's going to win. At Alabama, again, I think the Bulldogs are going to be favored. At Texas, okay, that's going to be another challenging one. At Ole Miss, all of those teams, not as easy of a path as the other one. But and there's some other small tweaks there. We've talked about that in our last show. You thought Georgia was actually in a slight loser in the offseason, only because they didn't really have a big splash. And I conversely said, hey, given what happened at Alabama, I think they were happy things didn't get quite that exciting. And they brought in some great talent. Obviously, Trevor Etienne from Florida. You've mentioned a few of the others. There are going to be some good folks out there to complement the existing folks, in addition to another top recruiting class. And one thing I gave them credit, unlike some of the other teams, they really showed up for their bowl game despite not making it into the CFP, because they went in and they took care of business. And that's something that I think they share with another team that I admire that is in my top. I mean, Oregon. I'm going to just say Oregon's one of the other teams I admire greatly. And I think that was part of the things they also showed up for their bowl game. Maybe the opponent wasn't quite to the level, but they certainly didn't let their foot off the gas. Another small concern, even though they didn't lose too many people on the staff, Fran Brown, the secondary of Georgia is exceptional. Obviously, Fran Brown is now the head coach of Syracuse. Rebuilding a secondary, we'll see. Again, my expectations for Georgia are tremendous. They are literally, I'm expecting them to win the SEC. I'm just expecting them to potentially have a loss somewhere, more likely than my number one team. And therefore, that's why I put them as number two. So I'm almost certain we're talking about the same two teams. My number one was Ohio State. And again, I'm going to be honest, this is difficult because Kirby Smart is, at least through resume, a better coach. There's just, it would be weird to say anything but that. But watching what happened since the national championship after Michigan won the national championship, it's so funny because going into it, it was like, man, what happened to Ohio State? You barely showed up to your bowl game. Mizzou embarrassed you guys. Are you reeling from losing to Michigan and not being able to play in the conference title game? I mean, what happened? And then that is still, I mean, they are the reigning 2024 offseason national champions. That's absolutely clear. But look what they did. They returned guys who just didn't need to come back. Emeka Mbuka, Travion Henderson, Jack Sawyer, JTT, corners like Denzel Burke, Jordan Hancock. They've got Tyleik Williams on the line. They've got so many. And then what they brought in the portal, Caleb Downs, obviously we've talked about him. I think he's my lead, wow factor. In addition to Will Howard, Quinshon Judkins, all of those guys would be wows in and of themselves. But what really pushed them over the top to me was bringing in Chip Kelly, more so than Bill O'Brien, who, of course, left soon after to become the head coach of Boston College. I mean, with an incredible backfield to work from, and with Kelly's ability to use that kind of balance between a running game and a passing attack, I think they're going to just absolutely sail through their schedule. I mean, they have a soft non-con. They've got, maybe they followed the Michigan model. I don't know. But they've got Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall. Michigan and Michigan State are on the schedule, but they're both rebuilding. I mean, Michigan State, yeah, everyone's really hot on Jonathan Smith, and I am too, but this is his first season there. And Michigan, we've talked, a lot about what's going on over there. The tough games, and the one that I've circled because it's going to be a great October matchup, is when they go to Autzen. Who wins that game between the Ducks and the Buckeyes is suddenly going to have a whole other, that's going to be a big moment. I'm going to assume for this point, the Buckeyes have what it takes to, and boy, that's going to be, can you wait for the stories? Chip Kelly returning to, not like he hasn't played at Oregon before at UCLA, but the Chip Kelly returning to play at Autzen Stadium is going to be exciting. And of course, more of the mystery team, which is Penn State. They're good, but how good will we ever know? But if those are the two that the tough games on the schedule, when I was doing my analysis, I said, I'm going to give them that edge. Now, again, the minuses I will acknowledge, Ryan Day, does he have what it takes to push him over the top? And I hate belaboring that because I thought people were being a little unfair to him, a little ridiculous. But that's just the inherent kind of irrational nature of college football, which is also something I never want to see leave. So bless that. And, we're always wondering, sometimes when you load up on transfer talent or just load up on talent in general, it doesn't quite work. It doesn't quite mesh. And we still have to see who's going to stick around after the spring game, particularly with that quarterback room, which is absolutely loaded. But I thought it was a very close call. And between the seeding number 1 and number 2, I put Ohio State is number 1.
So I have Ohio State number 2. I think that they're relatively, at this point, easy choice for that. One thing that I will say, though, is you mentioned Ohio State has an easier schedule. There's no doubt about that. My question is, and I do expect both these teams and every team, by the way, in the SEC and Big Ten to lose games because they're going to be playing a lot of top 10 opponents. But if Georgia is 1 loss behind Ohio State in the loss column, right? If they have 2 losses and Ohio State has 1, for example, I think that Georgia should still be the number 1 team because their schedule isn't just harder. It's like another planet. You get Clemson at a neutral site, at Alabama. Alabama's rebuilding a little bit, but they'll still be a top 15 team most likely. At Texas, at Ole Miss, who's a team that we're going to get to later on this list, versus Tennessee as well. So that's potentially 5 games against college football playoff contenders, whereas Ohio State, you go to Oregon, that is a great game, incredible game. In a 4-team playoff in a previous year, in a previous Big Ten, that game alone might be enough to get you number 1 or number 2. I don't think that's the case anymore with the way that some of these schedules are going to be. You mentioned at Penn State, that's going to be a tough game, absolutely. Michigan, we'll kind of see what they are. I'm curious to have maybe a Michigan conversation when we get further down this list. But like 7 or 8 teams on this schedule, Ohio State's going to be favored by 10 plus points. Like, this is not close to the type of schedule that Georgia's playing. It's not on the same planet. So, whenever we're having the conversation, whenever the playoff committee is having this conversation, I don't think that you can treat these 2 schedules as being comparable. I'm not going to say that it's all the way as being, well, it's an SEC versus a group of 5 schedule by any means, but I don't think that they're peers when it comes to scheduling. And so we've seen the College Football Playoff Committee before punish teams for having weak out-of-conference schedules, and this is as weak an out-of-conference schedule as you're going to see in college football this year. And again, some of this does depend. If Penn State and Michigan end up being top 7 teams, then that helps ease the burden a little bit. If they're more like top 15 teams, then I don't think that you can have a conversation between what Georgia's going to play this upcoming year in Ohio State. So to me, I agree that the schedule is much harder. The path is much harder for Georgia. But I do think in a 12-team playoff world, wins and losses are going to be slightly less decisive. If, for example, I mentioned 5 college football playoff contenders that Georgia's going to play, plus a conference championship game that is going to be probably a lock against a top 5 opponent. I think in the Big Ten, you expect it'll probably be Oregon again, so maybe that's a top 5 opponent. But if it's not, if Oregon flops, let's just say if Oregon flops, it could be against the 9th best team in the country, right? It could be not a real national title contender. So a lot of context is going to go into that. For me, that put Georgia just slightly ahead.
One thing I'm curious to see, and I know it could go one way or another in both our interpretations of this, is because both of those teams have an enormous amount of talent. Of course, we say that before the season, then you see how people mesh. Sometimes a player goes even beyond expectations. I mean, if we talk about Penn State, we'll even talk about like someone like Drew Aller. Well, like, well, can he reach what the potential we thought he had? But I'd be curious to see if, for example, and again, weaker schedule, but if Ohio State shows a level of talent, if all of these guys just mesh well, suddenly I wonder, because I mean, obviously with Jordan Travis, we certainly learned that the committee is willing to look at the talent of individual players. So if they just see across the board, again, Georgia's going to be talented no matter what. But if they say like, wow, what we're seeing from Will Howard and company versus Carson Beck and company, which team are we kind of deciding is the bigger firepower? I'd be curious to see if that plays into it as well. I mean, all I know is like those will be some, if we get to that point, those are going to be some very, very interesting post-show calls with the press to see how they decide to explain it. Goodness. So now let's take a look, because again, we've got 3 and 4 are also going to be conference champions. We're not going to talk about who might be, there's no question of, the loser of the SEC title game is also going to be in the top 4. First of all, that because they'll probably still be in anyway. They just won't be in the top 4. I mean, just they'll be ranked in the at-large spots. Who did you have as your next conference champ?
Well, I'll tell you what, this is like a nightmare year, I think, for the first year playoff for the mid-2, because over the past couple of years, we've had multiple years, whether it's 2023 Florida State, 2022 TCU, some really good Baylor teams, a really good Oklahoma State team. We've had multiple teams that have a very good case to be top 4, if not top 6 or 7. This is not one of those years. This is one of the weaker years, I think, that we've seen in a little while from the ACC and the Big 12. Part of that is, a team that probably won't end up making my list because what happened this offseason is Arizona. If Arizona was able to kind of rebuild and bring guys back, I think that they're in the conversation for a top 7 or top 6 maybe. But I have them just outside because of what they lost this offseason. And similar in the ACC, right? Florida State had a huge exodus of players after missing the college football playoff. And so you're kind of in a position where you're saying, can Florida State rebuild it immediately? Is Clemson ready for prime time? Is in any one of these conversations? I ultimately, again, went a little safe here. And I'm going to go with Utah. Utah managed to be a 9-win team in a very good Pac-12 this year, despite missing their 2 most important offensive players, that being Cameron Rising and Brent Keithy at tight end. Both of those players are expected back in 2024. They're expected to be back fully healthy. They did lose some pieces on the defensive side of the ball, but that's, I think, where you just kind of embrace development and the process that Kyle Whittingham has had with this program over the past couple of years. Offensive line, I think they grew quite a bit over the course of the season. And I think that actually in some ways joining the Big 12 is going to be great for them being able to go into Texas and continue to develop receivers, right? I mean, to be clear, this is a program that recruits Texas as well as anybody in the first place, but now you actually get to play games in the state of Texas. I think that that's going to end up being a huge boon for this program. So look, I don't think that next year is the best Utah team that we've gotten in a while, but I do think that when I look at the state of the Big 12 right now, there are some high upside picks I think you could make, including Arizona, by the way. I'm going to be keeping a close eye on the schools in the Sunflower State of Kansas. I think that they have a lot of upside, but I think that if you're asking me right now today, who's going to win the Big 12, I'm leaning on Utah, and I think that they will be a better team at this point than the ACC champion.
Yeah, Utah was my number 3. And to me, that was one of the moments where I'm like, wow, it's so weird to now think that my number 3 team. Because again, Utah, I think they're going to be fine. I think they're going to be a top 25 team, probably in the teens or maybe top 10. But number 3 seed, I had that same conclusion. Like, people are going to be shocked when they start realizing what's about to happen.
Yeah.
And again, I don't know if that's going to suddenly cause, and now suddenly I'm like, I remember I was like, oh, that's what Greg Sankey's worried about. When they're asking for all these automatic qualifiers, I was literally looking at these. And again, I think it's a product of just, as you said, how weak the mid-2, and I like that. That really is a good name for them, how they're kind of developing out here. And then, I have to also admit, And I agree 100% with Arizona. Arizona would have been the leader, but at this point, I'm not. I think Brent Brennan's a good coach. I think he's brought in some good people like Dino Babbers, but I think it's too vague for me to know, especially with a team that has hovered at the end, only just climbed out of being kind of in a pretty deep hole. And so part of it was, again, I remember I took my Big 12 candidates, I rolled them side by side, who they got coming back, what's their schedule look like, who's even playing each other, because these schedules are now, these conferences are still big enough. Even, I mean, we talk about the two super conferences, but these conferences, the ACC and the Big 12, have also gotten really big. It's interesting because they're one of the teams that's playing a conference opponent as a non-conference. So Baylor, but Baylor, this is not a great. We'll see where Baylor is. I mean, Baylor is.
I think that they'll be very good. No, we'll see what happens. I think that Utah will obviously be favored in that game. Although last year Baylor sucked, and look what happened. They nearly shocked him.
Yep, absolutely. I'm going to be the tough game is at Oklahoma State. And Oklahoma State's a team where I'm like, man, they could win. They could go all the way.
Definitely.
But I just kind of decided that if push comes to shove, I think that Utah is more likely to win out. But I think they're going to take some losses. Maybe it'll be at Houston. I mean, I'm really looking forward to seeing what Willie Fritz has going on over there. But I think overall, just it's the consistency of the coaching stuff. I mean, Kyle Whittingham has now been there for 20 seasons, which to me, I actually like thinking like, wow, has it been that long since Urban Meyer was there? Because to me, I still remember Urban Meyer going from Bowling Green to Utah and, that 2005 season. I guess time does pass on us. But that consistency, the coordinators have all been there forever. Like, they know what they're doing. And as you pointed out, that offensive line developed out. I mean, they were starting 4 sophomores and a freshman last season, and they're all coming back. So that can only make them stronger. And that is a program that is known for being physical. So that experience, that development, bringing back Kyle Rising, who I hope stays healthy. I think there's a lot of potential there. And yeah, I think they're a safe third pick. So who do you think is going to win the ACC? Because this was one where this could go so many, as we just talked about the Big 12, like it's more of a mystery. Like the ACC, I actually at one point was like, I'm just throwing a dart between 3 teams at this point. Who did you go with?
Yeah, it's not great. It's not great. This is not how, if you're the ACC, you wanted to enter the 12-team playoff world. I mentioned Clemson. I mentioned Florida State. Am I going to do it? I think I'm going to do it. In Jeff Brom, we trust. I'm going to go with Louisville. They had a really great first season. It's so funny. This is how college football works sometimes, right? The only real game that people watch, or maybe the only games that people watched of Louisville last year, were like them collapsing against Kentucky in a game that they should have won, and then like not appreciating how good Florida State's defense was in the ACC title game. People were like, "This program's a joke. These guys are so bad," and it's like, no, man, like the teams like Florida State was just really good on defense and knew that they had to play a specific type of game to win with a third-string freshman quarterback. And they did, and we had that conversation. That's over. But Louisville, for a first-year team, grew so much over the course of that first season. And defensively, I love what they do out there. They managed to stock up in a very expedient way, I guess you could say. And now the question is, can they figure out the offense? And if you're asking me, can Jeff Brom figure out the offense with another year of recruits and transfers? I mean, I feel pretty good about that. They brought in the number 6 transfer class in the country. They have Tyler Shuck coming in as a transfer from Texas Tech. Now, if you know anything about Tyler Shuck from his time at Oregon or Texas Tech, probably going to get hurt. But I also like who they have there behind him. Pierce Clarkson is a player who they were very high on in the last recruiting class. They managed to keep him around. And so I do think ultimately they're going to be okay at that position, potentially better than they were last season. And then you look at some of the weapons that they bring in as well. Ja'Cory Brooks coming in as a transfer from Alabama. He was somebody who a lot of people thought would be up next with the Tide before ultimately Isaiah Bond kind of passed him by, but still a very good player. Monroe Mills, another longtime starter at tackle coming from Texas Tech as well. And I think that then you also have to look defensively. Tyler Barron, one of Tennessee's top defenders, coming in as an edge rusher. So this is a team that I think I was already pretty excited about coming into 2024. And they had a really good offseason. They bring in a great transfer class. And I also just trust the staff, man. Like, Jeff Brom got Purdue to the Big Ten title game. And we can talk about the Big Ten West, but Purdue's one of those programs that's supposed to be bad. That you're not supposed to take seriously. And he managed to get them to a Big Ten title game. And it probably wasn't his best season of coaching at Purdue. Now, I think with the transfer class that they're bringing in, mixed with the fact that Florida State is in such a reloading gear, I don't think they're going to be quite ready for prime time right away. Clemson, I think, is probably the top contender to make the college football playoff and earn that 4 seed. But I need to see it. They've regressed each of the last 3 years. I need to see it come back. I need to have a little more confidence in what they're doing. And I need to have some confidence that they have means of fixing this roster without their embrace of the transfer portal. And so ultimately, I'm going with Louisville. I think this is a program on the rise. And I will say, too, this would not shock me if it's a Clemson-Louisville ACC title game and Louisville pulls an upset to ultimately steal this spot. That maybe they're a top 15 team, but then they manage to pull the upset, and that's enough to get them the 4th spot. And I'll tell you what, that's going to happen probably at least in one of these next 2 years, right? A Big 12 team or an ACC team that wasn't supposed to make the playoff is going to steal a bid. And people are going to have some thoughts and conversations about it. And I think that maybe Louisville might be that team in 2024.
I'm impressed by that pick. I was debating about Louisville because, again, I really liked them last season. They were my dark horse for as long as I could keep them credibly as a dark horse. But this season, no, I went a little safer. I think Dabo will get Clemson kind of in the situation. Again, I'm not expecting necessarily a top 5 team, but as we said, you don't need to be that to get into the top 4 seeds. That opening game against Georgia, we're going to learn a lot about Clemson. And I don't think they're necessarily going to win that one, but we're going to learn a lot about the type of program we've got. And again, I was looking at that schedule. I agree with you about Florida State. I'm expecting to be a bigger rebuilding job than some people are giving them credit. And I think even though they're going to Tallahassee, I think they have a strong chance of winning that game. Louisville hosting them, I'm a little bit more on their side. And they have, and again, I should say the other game, the other ACC contender out there that I was having trouble placing was NC State. And they also go to Clemson, which will somewhat favor the Tigers. I think, and you're right, they have lost people. They haven't necessarily, they haven't been masters of the transfer portal in any stretch. We'll see how the rest of this offseason goes. Maybe we'll suddenly see in the spring portal, they'll say like, hey, you know what? Maybe we'll take some people. Who knows? I mean, anything can happen. You know, the world, it depends. It's like quantum physics. Anything could theoretically happen, right? But I think there is a lot of chance here for some quarterback development for Cade Klubnik. I think it could get to that point. And again, in a very tough selection, I went with kind of the safer pick in the sense that I think Dabo is we'll just go back to Tyler from Spartanburg, man. This has been the rise from that, and they'll get somehow able to win the ACC. But I think that's a good moment. We'll just take a quick little break, and we'll come back and talk about our at-large plus G5 conference pick for a too early not top 25 CFP rankings here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, so now we've talked about who we think our top 4 seeds will be. Again, not the top 4 teams in the country. We're not trying to come up with the AP top 25, the coaches top 25, or however you want to say it. We thought, again, more or less similar vein. We flip-flopped our first 2 picks. So Shehan thinks Georgia's going to win the SEC and be the number 1 seed. I think, and Ohio State, which will win the Big Ten, will be the number 2 seed. I just reversed those. Could go either way. We both kind of agreed on that. But then we got into the fun world. Both of us agreed that we think Utah seems to be the favorite to win the Big 12 and therefore get one of those other top 4 seeds. And as the number 3 seed, we diverged a bit on the ACC. I went with the safer Clemson pick, and Shehan went bold with Louisville. But those, again, that'll be an interesting one because as we said, like there's going to be fans out there that are going to be surprised to see who those top 4 are, especially the most casual fans who might just only tune in at the end of the season. They're going to be like, wait, how good was he? Maybe they may not even paid attention in the regular season. Like, wow, Utah was that good? And they're like, how do they have 3 losses? Or I'm not saying they're going to have 3 losses, but it'll be interesting to see how that all pans out. But all of that said, we now have 8 more spots to fill. One of them is going to be the G5 champ. Where did you go next?
Yeah, so the G5 champ, and I will say, like, this, I don't think it's going to be every year, but this year, they're going to be the 12th seed. There's no doubt about it. They're going to be the 12th seed. And again, this is not the greatest G5 year that we have ever seen. There's opportunity for teams to rise, I think. I think that, I think that there's some maybe like penny stocks you could consider buying, whether it's UTSA in the post Frank Harris era and them figuring things out, whether it's John Summerall being able to quickly take Tulane back to AAC prominence. It's going to be a tough pathway for them, though, just with some of the players that they lost. I'm going to pick a team that I think had a really good offseason as well, in a funny way. I'm going with Boise State. So Boise State makes a coaching change, ultimately promotes defensive coordinator Spencer Danielson to the head coaching spot. They just announced that Dirk Cutter is coming back as offensive coordinator this upcoming year. They bring in the number 1 JUCO wide receiver, Chris Marshall, a former Texas A&M and Ole Miss player. And they also bring in Malachi Nelson at quarterback, somebody who, his stock slipped a lot after a seemingly lackluster freshman year at USC, but somebody whose talent I think should translate in a big way to Boise State and to the Mountain West. And when I look at Boise State, I think defensively, they rebuilt their culture. I mean, they are defending at a very high level right now. And I think offensively, they managed to do just enough to make things work. But I don't know how high the ceiling was with Taylon Green playing quarterback for them. I think that he had limitations as a passer. Malachi Nelson coming in should not have limitations as a passer. I think that they'll be able to protect him decently well. I believe George Holani is coming back as well, the really good running back for them. And so when I look at the totality of their team, in the context of a Mountain West that is kind of going through a season of change as well, I think that they are the team that not just is potentially the best group of 5 team, but I think is also the program that is probably the most above the rest of the field in their conference. And so for that reason, I have Boise State being the first ever group of 5 designated champion coming in at number 12.
I was really strongly considering Boise State because, again, as you mentioned, they've got a great running back with Ashton Genty. They've got that. My only reservation with Boise State was that schedule, and I like the fact that they brought back Cotter. I welcome back Cotter is how I've heard it said because for those who don't know, Boise State's rise to being this G5 power started with him, although he didn't stay there for long. Then he took the Arizona State job, and Dan Hawkins got them up to the next level. He leaves for Colorado, and then Chris Peterson's the one that took him to the elevation because Chris Peterson's first season was the famous Fiesta Bowl game. So again, they've had that rise, and that's a great name to see back, and someone who certainly enjoys the program and has been an assistant with the program in the previous years, since he left as well. But I'm worried about the schedule, and I'm worried that we're going to end up with a situation like kind of what happened to SMU, where it's like you did well in your conference, but dropping some games early on might affect where they rank you among the G5 champs. So they've got, again, a tough schedule. They got at Oregon, they've got Oregon State, and they've got Washington. They're playing the Pac-2. They could be Pac-2 champs. That would be hilarious because there's only 2 of them. They could be the Pac-12 champions if they win their game, hosting Oregon State, and they host Washington State. But that's still a tough lineup. The game at Oregon, you can just pencil that one.
Yeah, that's a loss. But I don't think that'll count against them at all.
That one as a loss. But that one, they could survive that one. I certainly agree. I also looked at Air Force. I also considered UTSA as an outside chance and App State, but that I still don't know what to predict from App State at this point. They'll look great and then completely barf the next game. And they're just too unpredictable at this point for me to take them seriously. I mean, keeping Caden Salter, knowing how good Jeremy Chadwell is, the money they pour into that conference, pardon me, into that team, and just the sheer week they have. Liberty has another just dog of a schedule. And I remember going into this last season because we had these conversations in the preseason that I did, and some of these other conversations I get into. I'm like, yeah, they could win out, but they've got the worst schedule. They'll never make it. It's impossible. And look what happened. So this season, there's a little difference going on here. Liberty, okay, yeah, they got blown out by Oregon, but people are going to remember that. Hey, yeah, they were really good last year. They were good for a G5 team last year, even though we'll look at past the opponents they played. I think they're going to have a little bit of momentum, or as we used to say, poll momentum. That's going to keep their opinion, the opinion of them, maybe even higher than it was in the previous season. So that opinion, even if they go through the murderer's row of Campbell, New Mexico State, UTEP, East Carolina, App State. My goodness. Oh yeah, Kennesaw State. Now I forgot they're in FBS. My goodness, Jacksonville State. How many of these teams? It's so funny when you look at their schedule. Like 3 of these teams, Kennesaw State, Jacksonville State, and Sam Houston, were FCS not all that long ago. I mean, their schedule is absolutely. If it's not the weakest, it's going to be close to the weakest. But I think that might still be enough. And I could be surprised, but I agree with you 100%. This is a really awkward year for the first year of the 12-team playoff because there isn't a very strong G5, and it's very unclear who's going to be in the lead in the Big 12 and ACC. So we're going to see some teams that get in there and may raise some eyebrows, but I again, this seems like an exceptional year for that than what we've typically seen before. But
Yeah,
those are our. Oh, go ahead.
Just a real quick talk on Liberty. I do think that they very much have a chance. I think that they should go 13-0 again. I do think that 2 things will be working against them. One, I mean, you look at the other top contenders, they're going to have measuring stick games against Power 5 or opponents that we consider to be relatively high level. The other thing that I think is going to be held against them is I do think that what happened last year against Oregon is going to be held against them. They're going to need to prove to, I think, a lot of people in that committee room that they're even better than they were this past season. And so that I think is going to be a stumbling block for them. The other piece of this too is, I mean, yeah, if they lose one game, I think it's over. I think it is totally done. Last year, the other thing I'll mention as well is SMU was a 2-loss team, and and I think that was ultimately a pretty significant damper. There weren't very many other major contenders. Like even in the AAC, Tulane was seen as the better team, and SMU pulled an upset. If Tulane wins that game, I think that they're easily into the New Year's Six spot. I think that there are just too many teams in the group of 5 this upcoming year that are considered quality for Liberty to be able to kind of just skate through, I guess you could say. But I do think that, again, if they're very dominant, like if they're notably better than last year, I think that's probably their pathway. But I don't think they'd be able to replicate what they did last year with the group of 5 this upcoming year and potentially make the field.
Yeah, I think my view is actually the skepticism of the rest of the G5 field being able to necessarily go with one loss. But I love that because that's the wonderful thing about going into the season. There's going to be some team we're not even thinking of that could end up being that contender, because we all remember how close I mean, again, that's the joy of college football. I think it would be fun to jump now to the at-larges and going back to the top of the list, because I just realized I set up a rematch because my number 5 is Oregon, and that would end up being Oregon versus Liberty again, which would actually be a disaster in so many ways. But again, I was trying to think of, when I'm trying to do the at-larges, I do expect some of these top conference runner-ups to be that next team up, and I think it will be Oregon at this point. I guess that might mean they'll have 2 losses, both to Ohio State, at the way I just cut that. But there's just so much strength going on there with keeping Dan Lanning and company, keeping his coordinators again, returning some talent. But then that transfer portal haul was solid. We've talked about it from our previous episode with Dylan Gabriel, Dante Moore, Evan Stewart, a lot of just so many people we could go through. Great recruiting class. The classic question of how they'll all mesh, but they again have the schedule is what really sold me on them, because manageable non-conference. They got Idaho, Boise State. It's weird to say this, but the Civil War against Oregon State is also going to be a non-conference game. Ohio State's coming to Autzen, so I think again we've said depends how that game goes. And then the other challenging teams are all rebuilding in some way. I mean, they're hosting Michigan State, but again, I've said that's a bit of a rebuilding year. Michigan and Washington are also rebuilding. I think this is an opportunity for them to potentially, if not win out, or even potentially split a game with Ohio State. I think they'll still have a very high at-large ranking, and I felt comfortable putting them as my number 5. How about you?
Yeah, I am also setting up a rematch, but this time between Oregon and Boise State. So I will be curious. I will be very, very curious, actually, whether we see just like a little bit of like messing with the rankings, right? In a way that doesn't actually matter. You know what I mean? Where, like, hey, if Oregon's 5 or 6, it doesn't actually make that big of a difference. It doesn't actually change the playoff that much. But not only would this be a rematch, this would be a rematch at the same location of a game that already happened this year. So, does the committee maybe just want to say, like, hey, maybe not, maybe let's not do that? So I do think that there's a chance that that they could slide maybe one of these other teams up to number 5 and put Oregon at number 6. But I agree, out of the top 4 and really outside of the top 2, I think that they're probably the safest bet this upcoming season. They return more than most of the other major contenders outside of that top 2. And like you said, I love the fact that they have kind of the old and new of quarterbacks, right? They have Dylan Gabriel to kind of bring a steady hand. They've got Dante Moore that maybe if he hits a different level, you have that as a backup. And so I think that they're going to be really, really good this upcoming season. Great defense like they had last year, adding 4 defensive backs to that room as well through the transfer portal, continuing to get even more dynamic at receiver. And the other part that you have to mention about this too is that Oregon's 2023 recruiting class is about to be second-year players, and it was a fantastic recruiting class. So they're only going to continue to get better, I think, under Dan Lanning. And so I think I agree. For me, they are the number 5 team. I'm going to jump to my number 6 team because I think that there's a little bit of a natural conversation between these two teams. And I don't know where exactly I stand on it. So with my number 6 seed, I'm going to go with Texas. I think that, you look at this past year, Texas was the best team in the South by a pretty, Georgia was really close, but they were the top team in the South, I think. And obviously, bizarrely, that wasn't enough to make the national championship game for the first time since 2014 and only the second time in like the last 25 years. But they bring, some key pieces back led by Quinn Ewers. The thing that I'm having trouble with Texas, of getting them all the way to being either in the top 4 or being a clear national title contender, is one, that they lost an entire top 5 national rush defense, which is to say Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy are gone. They do not have the pieces to replace those guys. Nobody does. That was the best combo in the entire nation last year. So even if they're a very good unit, that is a huge step back on the defensive line from what they were last year. I do think they have a chance to be better in the secondary to maybe make up for it a little bit, but that's still huge. The other piece of this is that they've got a couple of offensive linemen to replace. They're losing potentially 2 receivers who are going to go in the top 2 rounds of the draft. They mitigate that a little bit with Isaiah Bond leaving, but I don't think that's, or Isaiah Bond coming in, I don't think that quite replaces what they're losing as well. So I think part of this question is just ultimately, do we expect this team to be better than it was last year? Because I think that, one, that's what I think it'll take for them to be a national championship contender. And 2, I think that when you look at their upcoming schedule, that's what it's going to require. They go to Michigan, they host Georgia, they play Oklahoma as usual, they go to Texas A&M in what's going to be a highly competitive game. Now, it's manageable overall. This is not a crazy SEC schedule by any means, but I think that there are 4 games that you have to win to be considered serious, and that's at Michigan versus Oklahoma versus Georgia at Texas A&M. If you lose any of those games, I think that that's a huge damper on the way that you're viewed. And then potentially you go back, and again, if you lose to Georgia close, like that's not the end of the world. But I think that 3-1 is what you have to do to be a top 6 or 7 team in the college football playoff race. So, one, did you have Texas next? And two, what was kind of your thought process behind Texas versus Oregon?
Yeah, actually, I did have Texas next. I was laughing when I was listening how you're talking because that's so many of my thoughts. My issue was again the talent differential. Like they're bringing back Quinn Ewers, which is great, and I mean every emphasis seems to be on him. But and I think Isaiah Bond, Matthew Golden, Silas Bolden, Mari Nyblack, all these transfers coming in will give him some weapons to work with. But that defense isn't. You mentioned it. You're losing two incredible talents on that line. So watching how they did with the talent they had last season, we saw there were games, we talked about them, where they would kind of let the game get up from under them, and then they'd have to come back or just hold back that other team. When the talent level drops a little bit and you're going to the SEC, again, I agree the schedule is a little bit more favorable than I had expected for them in their first. They're not Florida. They actually have they don't have as bad of a murderer's row headed their way, but there are more opportunities for things to get out from under them. And so I felt the consistency at Oregon and just how they run that program and how they've looked and who's coming in and their system versus a Texas team where I mean, I don't like putting that much faith in one person. Now, it can work out. I mean, that's what Washington was to some extent. Like, that offense was incredible. The defense was good, but I mean, the offense, we were watching what Penix could do and throw to those receivers, and then he had an off day at the worst possible time, and it came crashing down. With Texas, I'm a little bit more concerned that there are opportunities for some of the issues that we've seen to come back and bite them. But I think, again, I've got them as my number 6 as well. I think they'll make it pretty far, and they'll almost certainly get in that large bid unless things go completely off the rails.
And to be clear, right, like this conversation is simply like, are they going to win the national championship next year, right? Like this is not an are they going to be very good, one of the best teams in the SEC conversation. This is okay, can they get from being in that second group to being in that first group? And I think that for me, I think Oregon's just half a step closer than Texas is heading into next year. With that said, I'm going to jump in and make my next pick. So we've got one more from the Big Ten, one more from the SEC. That's probably going to be a little bit of a theme whenever we go through these next couple of picks. With my next pick, I'm going to go with Ole Miss. And we had a chance to talk about Ole Miss and their offseason a little bit on on earlier this week's show. I view Ole Miss as a team that is searching for their moment. They're looking for their true breakout season. They've had 10, 11 win seasons, but not one where they've actually competed necessarily for the SEC or actually competed for the college football playoff. And this is the year that I think that finally happens. You look at them bringing in 2 transfers on the offensive line from Washington. Defensively, I mean, Walter Nolan coming in on the defensive line, that's as good of an addition as anybody made in the country this past year. Jackson Dart now heading into his 3rd year as a starting quarterback, bringing back a number of key receivers as well. And they lost Quinshon Judkins, and I think that's going to be a big loss for them, but they bring in a transfer running back from LSU, and Ulysses Bentley also showed some really nice stuff in his 2nd season on campus. So I think that this is the year where Ole Miss decided we have to be able to hang up front with the best teams in the SEC. That's where they've struggled the most on both sides, frankly. They haven't been up for the challenge. I think that they see the transfer portal as an opportunity to fill some of those gaps, replace some of those holes. And I think ultimately they've got a team heading into next year that I think is ready for prime time in a lot of ways. And so ultimately, I think that they're going to be a half step behind, again, those top tier teams in college football. Like, I don't necessarily think that they're a national championship contender, but the combination of what they bring back, the coaching staff that I think has done a really good job, and a transfer class that I think could be one of the most impactful in college football this upcoming year, I think most of the holes feel pretty filled. And I think that's what they need to be that, compete to be that second or third team in the SEC.
No, and it's interesting too. For me, I think they're in my top 25. My top 25. Dang it. Force of habit. They're in my 12, but I put them as number 10. Again, I think some of these middle ones are going to be kind of not a huge deal. I think I'm just still a little hesitant to say now, granted, they had their first, it's amazing to think that was Ole Miss's first 11-win season. I just need to see Lane Kiffin get them past some of these humps for me to put them a little higher in the seeding. That said, I agree with a lot of what you said. I think their toughest games are at home with Oklahoma and Georgia. Going to LSU will be interesting to see because again, that's an unpredictable one with those two apparently. But there's a lot to like. I mean, again, Jackson Dart, Trey Harris, Caden Prieskorn are here, and again, as you said, they've supplemented really well in the portal as they want to do. I want to keep us moving a little bit. So my number 7, I actually, and again, this is a team where they're fun to place because they're in their own little planet, and that's Notre Dame. We've talked about it before. They're the sweetest deal in the new playoff. We won't belabor that, but they have a good opportunity to get in there as an at-large. They're going to have probably a strong defense as always. And more importantly, Notre Dame sometimes has horrible schedules because of their scheduling habits, which I admire. But at the same time, this isn't too bad of one. I mean, their toughest game is actually one of their toughest games, and I love this one, is their opener at Texas A&M, only because it's going to be Elko versus Riley Leonard, the master and the apprentice playing each other. But I think that's going to be an exciting one. They have Louisville. I think they're not going to look past Louisville because they're really angry about how last year went. Florida State is kind of a mystery team. As we said, I'm not quite sure if I'm as optimistic at how good they're going to necessarily be this season. And ending the game at their classical rival of USC. And USC is another one. But again, they brought in Mike Denbrock as their new offensive coordinator. That should be exciting to see how he does with the player he's got with Mitchell Evans and some of these other guys, as well as Riley Leonard and bringing in Chris Mitchell and Bo Collins. I think overall they're going to be a strong enough team to get through a pretty reasonable Notre Dame schedule. And I think they'll probably be somewhere in the middle. So I placed them as number 7.
No, I have them at number 8. They're basically right, kind of what you described in that conversation. And so ultimately, I do think that that their path is very manageable. And when I look at, you mentioned Mike Denbrock coming in, I think he's going to be able to add a lot to that offense. And I expect them to take a step forward. So I actually want to pause for 1 second and have a conversation about one specific team. What is your approach to Michigan this upcoming year?
I didn't put them in my top 12. I didn't think they could make it. I think it's going to be too much I think the Big Ten is going to be competitive enough, and there's enough teams that are going to be on their level that I don't know if they'll be able to do enough. I thought Penn State is more likely to get in than they are.
On that note, what's your thoughts on Alabama heading into this year?
Alabama, I actually wrote down they have the name, image, likeness benefit of looking like a Saban Alabama team just long enough that they might get the benefit of the doubt. And if we're going to say Texas is going to be good because Quinn Ewers is coming back, Jalen Milroe, and yes, they don't have Ryan Grubb, but I still think Kalen DeBoer can do a lot with that. And they're bringing in enough talent that I think he can proceed well. Now, the hesitation for Alabama is they do have one of the most brutal schedules. Wisconsin's going to be an oddball. I'm very curious to see at Wisconsin because that's going to be a very quick benchmark of where's Alabama right now. But then they got Georgia, at Tennessee, Mizzou, at LSU, at Oklahoma, and of course the Iron Bowl. I don't think they're going to win through those, but I think they can take 2 losses and just based on that Alabama name, still make it into the playoff because it's Alabama. And I don't like saying that, but I think that's reality. How about you?
Yeah, I ultimately did put Alabama at number 9. And the reason for that is
exactly
I think
where I had them, by the way.
Yes. Okay.
Exactly.
There you go. We're back on the same page again.
Yeah.
So I think that there's a couple pieces of this. One, I mean, we can talk about the losses, but like Alabama's the most talented roster in college football still. Like maybe they're like second to Georgia now, but that's the kind of conversation we're having. Needless to say, it is more talented than any team that Kalen DeBoer has ever coached by a country mile. And he just took a team to the national championship last year. So I do think that he's going to be able to figure some things out. I expect them to have a fruitful post-spring transfer period as well. That's obviously something that you can't fully transfer or factor in, but I do think that that's going to ultimately play a part. And I do think that he is just a coach that figures things out. That's his job. That's his role. I think that this might, in a lot of ways, be the most Kalen DeBoer coach season of his tenure, where he just kind of takes some scraps and makes something beautiful out of them. And so ultimately, you mentioned it. I mean, the schedule is not easy. At Wisconsin, I think that's a win. Versus Georgia, I think that's a loss. At Tennessee is going to be I think that they probably go either 1-2 or 2-1, and that's probably the playoff case between Tennessee, LSU, and Oklahoma on the road. I think I lean 2-1. If it's 1-2, then obviously I think that it's going to be a little more difficult. But they're going to be right on that borderline. Ultimately, they're going to be in the conversation to make an SEC title game. Ultimately, maybe they finish like number 13, like the first team out. But the other part that you have to like too, let's say that they lose that Tennessee game, kind of get themselves in order. They play Missouri, at LSU, at Oklahoma. Let's say that they find ways to win those games. I think that people will like the way that they're finishing the year. So I'm going to have them at number 9. I don't feel amazing about it, but I'm going to have them at number 9. Number 10, I'm going to move back over to the Big Ten. I'm going to go with Penn State. I think that this is just the year that they have to do it, man. If they don't do it this year, then James Franklin needs to take take the USC job again, like we always talk about. He needs to, he just needs to move on. It's time if he can't make this work. We mentioned, of course, getting Ohio State at home. That's going to be a big game for them. And that's kind of their only real hard game. Like, I don't know, you go.
I don't know, that opener at West Virginia. That's going to be that's a hate rivalry right there. West Virginia would love nothing more.
Yeah, you're right. And if West Virginia would love nothing more manages to get this game, then again, James Franklin should be fired on the tarmac. Like, this is.
What do you make of the at USC game? What do you make of going to the Coliseum? That's another one I'm going to throw out there.
That's an intriguing game. I don't think it would be devastating to lose that one. Again, he can get tarmacked and then just walk right into Heritage Hall and take that job, like I mentioned. But I think that that's one that would be defensible to lose. I'm curious. USC is actually a team that we didn't talk about a whole lot on our Tuesday show. Probably should have talked about a little more as a winner of the offseason, the way that they revamped their defense. I think that with Miller Moss coming in at quarterback, the talent that they have, they want to be more Big Ten-y, I guess you could say. And so I could see them figuring it out. If this USC game was played in November, then I think that I'd like USC a little more. It's going to be very early in USC's Big Ten tenure when they get this game. So I think Penn State should win it. But let's just say, lose to Ohio State, I think that we're both projecting that. Let's say that they lose at USC. No other game to lose on the schedule I think is acceptable. So if they're a 10-2 team, I think that they've managed to find their way into the college football playoff. And this is also a culmination year in a lot of ways for that really, really, really good, the 2022 recruiting class, right? With Drew Aller and Nick Singleton and Katron Allen. Now it's 2024. This is the culmination year. All three of those guys can leave for the NFL after this year. So I do think ultimately this is a year that Penn State will be able to put some things together. Oh, and I have to mention too, Andy Kotelnicki coming in as offensive coordinator is one of the best hires of the entire offseason. I'm going to be curious to see what happens with the whole Drew Aller being a statue thing. I don't know how that's going to vibe with an Andy Kotelnicki offense, but also Andy Kotelnicki is awesome. He was the offensive coordinator at Kansas as they put together their run over the last 2 years. And so ultimately, I do think that he ends up being a difference maker for this offense, even if it's just finding unique ways to revamp this running back room and put them in unique positions. So I think it's enough. I think 10-2 should be seen as Penn State's floor this year. If it is worse than that, I will be severely disappointed in what this team accomplished. And I think that's going to be enough in the Big Ten to get them number 10.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that. And I'll also note that I think they did a good job of replacing Manny Diaz with Tom Allen. I think the defense should continue to be good. So there's a lot of things to like about Penn State. It's just, can they get past that hump? And I ranked them a little bit higher. I ranked them at number 8. But again, when we're looking at the bottom half of these seeds, it's not a huge deal. Now, heading over to, I had Ole Miss at number 10. You had Penn State as number 10. There's only one spot left. Who is, because we both have our G5s at the very bottom. Who is your number 11 seed?
So this is where it gets really interesting. I think that there's a couple different directions to consider. Missouri from the SEC, I think, will have a really good case. They've got a manageable schedule, and they were a top 11 team in the country last year. So there's a great case that they should be in that spot. I think from the Big Ten, we can have, again, a Michigan conversation. We both agreed just outside of the field right now, but they have the ability to play their way in. There's no doubt about it. With what they've built there and the way that they've recruited, I think that you could go to the ACC and see. I mean, again, you had Clemson as your conference champion. I have Louisville. I think that the winner of Clemson Florida State potentially could be that 11th team. And I think from the Big 12, look, if Arizona manages to continue to build even after losing Jed Fish, that's a team that you have to like. And I think the Kansas schools I mentioned, Kansas State, those are two schools that I would heavily consider. I think where I land, and this is hard. Like this spot is hard. This is probably the hardest spot on the entire board. I think the direction that I land is Florida State being an 11-2 team with a close loss in the ACC championship game. They have a manageable early schedule, which is important for me because I think it's going to take them some time to figure things out. Georgia Tech, Boston College, Memphis, Cal, all at home. They go to SMU. That'll be a fun game. Hey, I should go to that one. That one's right in my backyard. It's 15 minutes from my house. Then the next week they get Clemson at home. Getting them at home, I think, is a big deal. So their strength of schedule, like a lot of the conversation about Florida State is going to be the same as it was last year, by the way, about them not having a very good schedule, about them having some questions, and they're not going to be as good as they were last year. But I think that when you look at their overall roster, when you look at their coaching staff that I like a whole lot, when you look at their pathway, and when you compare it to how competitive it is going to be for Missouri as the 5th SEC team to get in, or for Arizona to manage their first year in the Big 12, or Kansas State, I think that I trust Florida State's path the most. Again, I don't feel great about it, but I think that that's my team.
Not bad. I went with another ACC team trying to fill that spot because, again, I was looking at, I could have easily gone with potentially K-State or Oklahoma State from the Big 12. I could have gone with Mizzou, but again, I think that schedule's tough. LSU
don't say Miami.
Get it together enough.
Don't tell me you're about to say Miami.
No.
Okay,
Miami's out there, but again, no, there are teams that were too many mysteries. Miami, Michigan, USC,
Yes.
Tennessee, Oklahoma. I'm like, too many mysteries there. I don't know what could happen. But I actually went with the Wolfpack. I thought North Carolina State could be that team that makes it in. Because again, I think I like Grayson McCall. I love that they brought him in. That's a huge deal. I think they've got Jordan Waters coming in from Duke, who is a good rusher. They've got some good talent there. And their schedule, week 1 is FCS, no problem. They have a neutral site game against Tennessee in Charlotte. So that they're going to probably be a good number of Wolfpack fans there. But I mean, Tennessee will show up, no doubt. If they can get past that game, the rest of their schedule, I think at Clemson is the hard one. But again, if you're in this group, you probably took a loss somewhere. So again, Louisiana Tech, Northern Illinois, Wake Forest, Syracuse, at Cal, Stanford, Duke, at Georgia Tech, and then the North Carolina rivalry. That is a circumstance where you can absolutely win out. So that's why I think they could very well be a surprise to go there. So yeah, that was mine. I just want to quickly, before we get, I want to wrap up. So now that we've announced our top 12 seeds. So for Shehan, it was Georgia, Ohio State, Utah, Louisville, Oregon, Texas, Ole Miss, Notre Dame, Alabama, Penn State, Florida State, and Boise State. So you went states to wrap this one up. Mine were Ohio State, Georgia, Utah, Clemson, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame, Penn State, Alabama, Ole Miss, North Carolina State, finally with Liberty. This is going to be such an exciting playoff. I cannot wait to see how this goes. Shehan, I know you wanted to add something.
Yeah, how do you, square your number 11 seed pick with the fact that NC State has like a ceiling built over the program where they're not allowed to win 10 games? I feel like that would be like a construction project that I'd need addressed before we can have this kind of conversation. I'm intrigued by the pick. I think the thing that's going to be tough for them, like I said, I mean, it is like they have not managed to reach that top level. It's very difficult.
Hey, Ole Miss was in the same boat, and last season they did. Ole Miss had never reached 11 wins, and they did. So I'm a believer now. I think teams can do it.
Yeah, but like that team hadn't won 10 games in a long time, and then that coach did it, and this coach hasn't done that. But I'm a big Dave Doran fan, to be clear. But I do think what makes this difficult is I think for NC State to have a chance, they have to win both of Tennessee and Clemson. I don't think that they have a pathway, unless I guess the alternative would be, okay, maybe you split those games and then you win, but then I think then you have to win, I think, the ACC title game. I think that that they probably have a better case to make it by winning the ACC than they do as the 11 seed. But at the same time, I mean, I'll tell you what, I would love to see it. I mean, I love me some Wolfpack.
Could you imagine if we get a situation where the loser of one of these conference, like probably would be the Big 12 or the ACC, the loser of the conference championship game doesn't go into the playoff, but the at-large is pulled from the other team that didn't make the that would be, I can't wait. God, that's going to be lots of talking heads going bananas, and I love it because it's also going to probably be lower stakes because we're going to be talking about 10th, 12th ranked teams, not a huge deal in all said and done, but I can't wait. People are going to get angry, and that's what we like. But I think that's a good. This kind of went on for quite a bit because there's so much to talk about. I cannot wait. This has got me so excited for the regular season. I cannot wait to have these discussions regularly as we get back into it. But thank you all for listening. On behalf of all of us here, on behalf of Shehan, on myself, and our producer, Joey Aliberti, if you get a chance, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe, and find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show. Thanks for listening, everyone. You can find Shehan's work on CBSSports.com, and it's always great talking to you. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.